In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy. Okay. Do I start now?
Sure, go ahead.
Great. Well, we had decided to talk about sex and sexuality on this podcast. And Max Golding sent me Cardi B's song, W.A.P, Wet Ass Pussy, which got me thinking a lot about third wave feminism and their determination not to criticize sexual objectification of women, but if you can't fight them, join them, objectify and our own sexuality and trumpet it and claim it, and in the current capitalist mood, commodify it. And the song Wet Ass Pussy really does trumpet that out. It starts, there's whores in this house, there's whores in this house, and this house is a very fancy house. And then they talk about it like, pay my tuition just to kiss me on my wet ass pussy.
Tuition just to kiss me on this wet ass pussy.
Mwah, mwah.
Wait, can I, before we go on, I actually want to just say for any listeners, we didn't say as a sort of disclaimer first, we're actually going to explore the lyrics of this song, it's super explicit. I mean, it's like about as explicit as some song lyrics could get. So just for any listeners that like don't want to
hear that,
I don't know if it's like really distasteful or something, like probably tune out, but we're going to like use the actual lyrics, and I might actually edit in some of the clips later.
In the grand commodification scheme, which is one of the huge mistakes of third wave feminism, there are several explicitly materialistic and commodifying lyrics. Pay my tuition just to kiss me on this wet ass pussy, moi, moi. He got some money, that's where I'm headed. Pussy A1, just like his credit.
He got some money, then that's where I'm headed. Pussy A1, just like his credit.
And when he fucked me and asked, whose is it? Obviously not a very personal interaction. Whose pussy is this? When I ride the dick, I'ma spell my name. You can, and now there's a little sadism and masochism thrown in as if they are empowering, which is, you can't hurt my feelings, but I like pain. Whoops. Okay, Chris Hedges in his book, America, the Farewell Tour, about the decline and destruction of the American empire, talks about sadism and extreme sex acts and commodification of sex as a symptom of a dying culture and a dying empire.
He got some money, then that's where I'm headed. Pussy A1, just like his credit.
And I think Wet Ass Pussy fits right in because there's nothing personal about this. In fact, starting from the beginning, in those few states that have sex education, there's only 28 out of the 50 states that require sex education, and only 17 require that it be medically accurate in their teaching of AIDS prevention, HIV education, and sex education, and only 1% of that minority that even offers sex education discusses relationships and also discusses the idea of mutual consent. So I looked up sex education in places like the Netherlands, Sweden, more civilized countries that now have no new cases of COVID, and tried to figure out how their children learn about sex, which prevents them from commodifying sex and engaging in BDSM. And I found that they begin sex education in kindergarten, that if the bee doesn't pollinate the flower, it doesn't grow. And then in middle school, they talk about each other's body and get to know their bodies and how they work, including their sexuality. And then in high school, they start talking about sexual relationships, what you owe to yourself, what you owe to your partner, how to be close, what intimacy means, and what it would mean if you created another human being through your sexual connection. And the emphasis is on connection once you get to human beings. Whereas even in the one state out of 50 that requires some discussion of relationship and consent, that's only one state, including all of the states and Washington, D.C. In the other 17 that allow medically accurate discussion of sex, that's what it is, a biological description devoid of relational content. In a civilized society, people talk about connection and affirm connection with one another. And I took the liberty of looking at those societies that have conquered COVID, unlike our society, which is the most out of control of any developed society in terms of COVID prevention and COVID tracking, testing, and treating. And those societies, whether they are New Zealand, headed by Jacinda Ardern, who has had one death due to COVID, or Danish society, which has had no deaths from COVID, headed by a different woman, Mette Frederiksen, have had no problem with people saying, my liberty is not wearing a mask. My liberty is not sheltering in place. They have emphasized we need to protect each other. And so no one has done that. That's an American phenomenon. And I think it's part of the decline of our society, which is reflected in Cardi B's song, in which Black women are depicted as animal-like, sometimes in animal skins with tigers roaming behind them, and Black men's penises as snakes of different sizes. They say they don't want a garter snake, they want a boa. That there is a dehumanization here, which is spectacular. And sex is an animal act for money, which is quite a statement about what's happened to our culture. And even what happened to feminism in its third wave, unlike its second wave, which was virulent against sexual objectification of women's bodies. And I thank Max for sending me this, because I'm older and out of the pop loop and didn't even see it until he brought it to my attention.
We were emailing about, well, what are we going to do our next episode on? And we had a few ideas, and you'd thrown around the idea of just sex, sexuality, and sex ed as like a general theme. I had just started to see through my like news feed algorithm, the social media gods had shown me W.A.P, and that there was a kind of media frenzy. I actually read I watched some like YouTube reactions people had to it, and I read a couple articles about it before I even watched the video, and then read the lyrics. I have a somewhat different but overlapping take on the song and this general phenomenon than Harriet. So mine is that if we zoom out of the actual content of the lyrics and the images in the video, and we ask the question, well, how did this end up happening? And not from like a cultural perspective of like, where did the arguably like racist or sexist stereotypes come from necessarily? Like, that's obviously like good to get into. And I think there's some interesting arguments that like in a similar way to like LGBT people taking back the word queer over decades long struggle, that there are some arguably reappropriated images and ideas, maybe from the video and from lyrics and stuff like that. I think to me, what's interesting is this the attention economy, which is a term. I'll just describe it briefly. It's that we're now in the internet age. That there's a whole economy based on just getting people's attention.
Mm.
And in the past, you'd call it a shock jock was a term. I remember my dad, who worked in radio for a little while, he would call people like Howard Stern a shock jock. People might call Alex Jones a shock jock or a Rush Limbaugh. They just sort of yell a lot, and they the titles of their episodes are really now we call it clickbait, but it's the point of getting a lot of attention from people in the way the algorithms work in social media, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, is that the more attention people give to something on the internet, the more the privately owned platform owners are going to make money from ad revenue and from people essentially being addicted to the platforms. So I know this isn't yet about sexuality and sex and sex ed, but we are going to bring it back, because when I saw the Cardi B thing, I was like, okay, this is like, I like the beat. I always have like Cardi B's style, like her rap style, like her flow, and I actually really like hip hop music. But I just thought like, okay, this is just sort of like another like all her videos are like this. They're hypersexual. There's this sort of maybe a veneer of like female sexual empowerment, and I guess I don't know enough about the waves of feminism, but Harriet's saying there was a third wave feminist push to have women just say, you know what, we're just going to be like, hypersexuality is totally fine. We're going to kind of take it back and just sort of own that. And that maybe it was a miscalculation because the objectification of women and disempowerment of women as a gender kind of continued through this like fake empowerment. Like, well, if we just say we're empowered, then we're empowered. But to me, more than that is just, well, like who profits from what Cardi B is doing? And my like one question is, well, how much money does she make from her own music? And she obviously must make a lot of money. I mean, well, I'm saying obviously, maybe not, but I think, I mean, she's probably like a multimillionaire by now. But there's the record companies, there's Google that hosts the YouTube videos. And then there's this whole network of people who then, like, there's conservative bloggers like Ben Shapiro, who then shame the hell out of her and shame the degeneracy of our culture and everything. And then you have sort of liberal feminists online talking about how Ben Shapiro is this like reactionary jerk and it's actually about female empowerment. So then you have this sort of like, it's not Cardi B and it's not Google and it's not YouTube and the record companies, but it's this whole sort of like auxiliary economy of people just talking about the media itself. They talk about the content and they can generate all kinds of ad revenue and attention to themselves and build sort of social capital and have people listen to them through the attention economy. So that's one lens through which I look at these kinds of videos and this kind of pop media stuff. And that, to me, there's a lot of kind of dangerous things about it, but one of the most is that I don't think most people engaging in the attention economy, or maybe 20 to 30 years ago, we would just call it mass media. Like, most people consuming mass media don't think much about the actual process, like what's sort of behind the scenes and how does this work? And why am I finding this media? Like, why are we even talking about Cardi B's like wet ass pussy song? Is it that relevant? Like, is it that important? Is it that good of a song? And so people will generate all kinds of commentary, whether it's like for the lyrics or against the lyrics or for her or for the imagery or whatever. But like, how did we end up? Why would anyone even talk about it? And I think it kind of just goes back to the shock value, first of all, where like it's essentially softcore porn. Like, they're dressed, they're barely wearing any clothes. Cardi B and I forgot the other woman's name. It's like something Stallion. They both have had like tons of plastic surgery to make like their boobs and butts like enormous. Yeah, Megan Thee Stallion. So they both like, gotten like crazy augmented like surgeries to modify their bodies. Like, the language is super shocking. So to me, like, that's a little bit more why people are even talking about it. But then they have to sort of create reasons for why they're talking about it. Like, oh, well, it's female empowerment. It's like women are having this moment where they can talk about, women can talk about having a wet pussy, first of all, so that's like anti-patriarchal or something. But But nobody's talking about the fact that there's this glorification, like within Cardi B and all mainstream rappers at this point. There's a glorification of like mansions and gold and like
Mm.
owning exotic pets and just like weird, like really literally like bourgeoisie kind of stuff. It's like
Mm-hmm.
these are ruling class messages, like the tippy top, 0.1% of people that own everything and are just passively generating income from a completely disempowered and disorganized working class are really the ones that are sort of setting the rules for like what's even getting talked about, and then the content itself is sort of reflecting ruling class values, in my opinion.
Yes.
Um, so that's one set of analyses, and I don't, in terms of like, so I don't know where I stand in terms of like, is the imagery like with the animals and like the snake dicks and and like the and all of that, like how sort of sexist or racist is it? On the one hand, I think the ruling class does want for there to be like an incessant kind of a number of prejudices and stereotypes just circulating within the working
Mm.
class population to disempower them. Like they want for those things to sort of act as a sort of toxic, um, disorganizing mechanism, I think.
Yes.
And I do think at the same time, like there probably are some women, some black women, some black men, like people who, Cardi B grew up in, I don't remember if it was Queens or the Bronx, but it's like a pretty working class part of New York where I'm pretty sure she was a stripper before she became a rapper. And this to me goes back to just the precarity of employment in the declining economy as well, right? Where, um, I had a teenage client last year who was like telling me really defensively that sex work is real work, and I don't know why people disagree with that. And when I turn 18, I'm going to be a sex worker, and there's nothing anyone can tell me, and like my
Mm-hmm.
parents are crazy for telling me not to. And like I wasn't even arguing with her; she just seemed sort of angrily like,
Mm.
"You better take me seriously." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, that's fine. Like do what you want. Like I'm not gonna lecture
Moralize.
you about anything." Um, but I think part of the reason that um, younger women, especially, are probably talking like that about sex work today, and in particular, they're talking more about sort of like being a cam girl and like doing kind of internet sort of porn things,
Mm-hmm.
is not so much because of, well, and maybe I'm wrong, and listeners, you can email us and let us know if you disagree with us. I don't think it's so much because there's like female sexuality is more acceptable or something. I think it's the precarity of the economy more than anything else. I think it's that
Yes.
young people have no idea what the hell they're going to do with their lives now. And I mean, climate change is like, they're like, do we have 20 years left with climate change? Will I ever own a home? Can I even afford rent based on the jobs that are available in my city? And so they think, well, if I just sort of like get naked online, like I might be able to pay my rent.
That's true. And the latest recession with COVID and Trump's mismanagement has
Yeah.
resulted in more female jobs cut even than male jobs because we women are in the caring professions, and more women having to stay home with children because there's no school and they haven't provided any alternatives with all these unemployed teachers in
Right.
armories and other places where they could tutor them and space them and take care of them, and childcare centers are cut. And so you have a combination of more cultural permission. Sex in the City was a program in which women were frankly sexual,
Hmm.
although they all were sexual within relationships. And the one woman who was the most sexually active at all of all was also sexually active basically within relationships.
Hmm.
But I think that one of the reasons the sugar industry has burgeoned, which is the industry in which largely young women, occasional young men,
Hmm.
sell sexual access as well as emotional access. They sell the most popular
Hmm.
thing in the sex trades, the GFI, the girlfriend experience, to some
Right.
wealthy man who comes to town sometimes and wants this young woman to be free for a week or two or a weekend and pays her tuition.
Hmm.
Sugar University is the most popular sugar site. And there you
Oh, wow.
see sexy, good looking young women with glasses on, um,
Hmm.
who are willing to be sugar babies for sugar daddies and work out their own contracts. And that has come up with the kind of costs of tuition. It's also, we should mention, the one field in which women have an advantage over men
mm,
in our sexist society.
mm,
And the places that they are most prevalent is the South, where a woman's, quote, virtue is her sex, her morals are her sex, purity cults, where a daughter promises her father, her guardian of her sexuality, to
mm,
be loyal to him and the family by not being sexual until she's married. And
mm,
those are the places where the sex industry, in terms of the sugar industry, are most prevalent, but they're also prevalent in New York City at NYU,
mm,
which is costs $228,000 for tuition for a year, and you're off half the year. So
mhm,
young women are pushed into sex work in order to avoid being saddled with debt that they pay off on average 20, it takes 20 years to pay off, and now they won't be able to pay them off because they
mhm,
can't get jobs. And so it's the precarity of jobs, it's the one advantage that women have economically, it's the wild
mhm,
hikes in tuition and costs
mhm.
that make the sex industry much more acceptable than it ever was. So it can be on a website.
Mhm.
And it's also a place in which women have greater equality because the sexual contract is worked out by the sugar daddy and the sugar baby. And then the sugar baby is not to mention it, so the man can have the illusion of being chosen. And
Mm,
if either party wants to break that contract, they can. So women go into it in part because they need the money and they won't be in debt when they leave school, and also because they don't want to be restricted in their careers by loving somebody and wanting to have a family and wanting
mm,
to keep house or feeling they ought to keep house and serve him. They want to be free to pursue whatever career they can or a life without the kind of commitment that means a huge reduction in salary. And
mm,
men, older men particularly, don't want to negotiate the changed terrain of gender equality and have to make an effort in relationships. So he gets this woman to do all the emotional labor in the relationship and usually to provide sexual satisfaction, not always, but
mm,
usually, and be there. And he can take her to conventions where he's showing his fellow businessmen or whoever his brainy, intelligent, good looking companion and gets quite a bit
mm,
of prestige from that. And so we
mm.
have a phenomenon in which women sell their sexuality. And in this video, which starts with the chorus, there's whores in this house, there's whores in this house, which is people selling their sexuality for money. And that is glorifying the one area that women have an advantage in the marketplace.
Well, and I don't think maybe as a step back thing too. Like I don't think I think if we lived in a different kind of society, there wouldn't be anything wrong with it per se. You know, like in theory, like a sort of hypothetical society where inequality wasn't so extreme, um, where if you could, because you know, I could see there being a society where it's like, okay, everybody's been sexually liberated and there's so much equality that you know you can just sort of choose to engage in sex work as like a very dignified sort of kind of work, and
Mm-hmm.
this is just what some people do, it's what some women do, what some men do, what some trans people do, gay men, like you know this sort of utopian whatever. And like one I've been seeing more and more critiques online of this idea, because I was getting sucked into this for a while too, where there was this idea emerging over the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years of the pro sex worker conversations getting kind
Yes.
of co-opted in some weird directions that I didn't really realize I was getting sucked into. So because there actually is nothing wrong with sex workers for doing sex work is just it is actually just totally fine. And so let's stop shaming sex workers. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. But then what it ends up kind of doing at the same time is it does erase all the women who are in really desperate, precarious situations, um, who really who wouldn't actually want to engage in sex work. They would want to just do something more. I don't want to say normal, but if they were
More
hitting a place in
comfortable.
their life, sure. I mean, and that's the thing. I guess even me saying this now, it's like I don't want to offend anybody because it's like there, and who knows what the actual proportion is, right? Like what percentage of women doing sex work like really are like, I just kind of want to do this, versus how many women are not necessarily forced, but because of economic conditions are engaging in it. And I think probably the majority, like my hunch is the majority of women doing it are in super economically precarious situations, and it's mainly desperation, or at least at best just like, oh, I really don't want to do that. I've even seen arguments where it's like, well, janitors don't want to scrub your damn toilet, like why don't we talk about that the same way? But my take is all of it should be talked about the same way, where
Hmm.
if an extremely unequal capitalism driven economy is causing people to do all kinds of things they don't want to do desperately for money to make ends meet, we should probably be talking about that a little bit more than I don't know, shaming the janitor for like not having gotten an education and becoming a doctor or something, and not shaming the sex worker for not, like, I don't know, becoming a school teacher or whatever the hell we think she should be doing. There was another, I kind of lost my train of thought. There was another thing I was going to say about it, but
It'll come back to you. I think
yeah.
what has happened is that the sex industry has burgeoned, and there are many more gradations and opportunities. Street prostitution is no longer there because people can be picked off the street, it's on the internet.
Mm,
And there are different gradations. Sugar
mm,
University are people who are graduate students or undergraduate students who intend to make a career, which is
mm,
different from a street hustler who's usually on drugs. And 85%, according to the studies that I've read, of street prostitutes were molested repeatedly as children and think, at least I'll get paid for this.
mm,
However, there's a drive because young women start life, if they want an education, and you can't get many jobs without one, they start life terribly loaded with impossible debt that they may never
mm,
be able to repay. And so they're pushed into industries like the sugar industry, which is huge in the United States, whereas
mm,
it's not huge in the Netherlands, where prostitution is legal and
mm,
where education is free, nor in any of the
mm,
other European countries like Germany, where education is free, or France, where
mm,
education is free, or New Zealand, or so on, any of these socialistic countries that have free education. So that the
mm,
pressure to have to make money or be in debt for the next 20 years minimum if you can get a job is off. And so, of course, as you say, Max, it's very much a reflection of the grotesque inequality of our society that would let
mm,
someone whose parents have money get through school, start an internship that's unpaid but very prestigious, and then go on to a job that could pay money because she's educated or he's educated. And that's very different from someone who would be in debt peonage for the next 20 years at minimum.
mm. Okay, here is well, this is another part of the thing I was going to say that piggybacks off that as well. So we have, because if you think of it as an industry, like there's sort of like owners, there's workers, there's producers, there's consumers, and then there's these whole, like, I don't know, there's like supply chains and all this stuff. The other piece of this that I think, I don't know which wave of feminism, but I think we talked on the phone one time about, what's her name, the like really the kind of like militant anti-porn activists. Was it Andrea
Andrea
Dworkin?
Dworkin, yeah,
Yeah. So those kinds of, yeah. So that kind of stuff that kind of was around for a little while, what, the 80s or something, maybe the 90s for a
yeah.
while. I think the other kind of side of the coin, I think, in because if we talk about sex work mainly kind of moving online, not entirely, but like there's a huge shift toward it online, and I've seen
Hmm.
some online discussions about how, like, this is safer for sex workers. You're
Hmm.
less likely to be, I don't know, like physically or sexually assaulted or whatever. So like that's progress. But so, like, who are the consumers of this? Well, it's mainly men. It's not 100%
Mm-hmm.
men, but it's mainly men. And I think so there's the shaming the sex worker problem, and then there's sort of shaming the sex work consumer problem, I think, on the other hand, because as we've talked about previously in our episode on like sex and dating and neoliberalism, I think the other sort of invisible problem here is it's a twofold issue between why are men so lonely and like so addicted to porn
Mm-hmm.
and sex work, like whether they are in a partnership and whether their partner is okay with it or not okay with it, or if they're just
Mm-hmm.
single and they're just almost like incel style, like no one's ever gonna fuck me or love me or whatever, and so just like porn all the time. So there's that aspect of it, and then there's that attention economy question too, because there's a huge difference between um, porn that's like everywhere at all times online for free, or it seems like it's for free, even though it's generating revenue for the whoever owns the websites and whatever. There's a huge difference between that and having to like physically go outside, go find like a prostitute or whatever. Most men aren't going to actually go like find, even if sex work were entirely decriminalized and stuff. Most men aren't going to go to strip clubs or to sex work houses and stuff like in the most ethical way. So porn has kind of made that
Mm-hmm.
thing easy for it's made it easier for the consumer. But the two-part problem that I kind of see with this is one, it's still attention economy driven to where like the stuff that Cardi B and others, there's this rapper named Cupcake. Is her name Cupcake, or is that the album? Yeah, this rapper, her name is Cupcake, and she has a song called Deep Throat, and the whole thing is just about like deep throating, like just like messy, aggressive, like blowjobs, and there's other female rappers that they're just like really, really hypersexualizing their lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when it first started popping up, there was that initial controversy of like, well, is this just a whole bunch of degeneracy? Why are these women doing this to themselves? And then there was, well, is it female empowerment? And there's all these sort of discussions about it. Um, I think it's a sort of pornification of sex
Mm.
phenomenon
Yes.
where porn is becoming more widely accepted for a variety of reasons. I think mainly because it's become such a dominant part of the internet economy and the attention economy, that you now are seeing it bleed into the culture to where female rappers will pretty readily talk about it because they know that it's going to give them a sort of wider audience. It's going to have a higher
Mm-hmm.
shock value and stuff. So there's all of that, right? So that just sort of puts it out front even more prominently than it ever would be. But then if you didn't have a consumer base, it wouldn't matter, right? So talking about the consumers, like why are men so into this stuff? Um, Again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with, I don't want to say, I mean, anything wrong with porn in and of itself. Any particular sex acts, any particular uses of lighting and angles and porn sets and the porn stars and the sex workers engaging in the work necessarily, because I think again, if you could remove all the different messed up parts of our society, you could say, oh well, these are just people are just sort of doing enjoyable stuff and everything's super consensual.
Mm.
But I think a really big part of it is that as as the US became largely deindustrialized, jobs were automated and outsourced, and unions were crushed, and families were being torn apart as a result, and everything. And as the information industry and the internet through the military industrial complex kind of evolved into what we see it now, into this like hyper capitalist thing, you simply have extremely isolated, lonely people
Mm.
sitting around wanting to have connections to people, and porn and the various kinds of available sex work online happen to kind of fill a void for people, similar to how McDonald's fills a void of hunger. It's just like kind of the worst way to fill the void of hunger. It's just so cheaply produced
Mm-hmm.
by people that don't really have your interest in mind. They have profits in mind. So that's sort of my theory behind men as consumers of porn, in that they are being exploited within a capitalist economy just as much as sex workers arguably are in a lot of regards. So,
Yes, I agree with that, but I also think that heterosexual porn includes
mm,
degradation of women. And
mhm,
because you're trying always to sell, the more extreme is the more
mhm,
saleable and new. So you have extreme violence
mhm,
in the porn industry, whereas the homosexual
Right.
porn industry is much more that people meet and they say, hello, let's fuck. And they do. And they
Mm-hmm.
both have a nice time.
Mm-hmm.
That it's much more egalitarian. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you're learning is that women want to be humiliated in sex. I have had a young client who thought that having her hair violently pulled was usually part of the sex act,
Mm-hmm.
and others who thought that being slapped was.
Mm-hmm.
And that they portray, some six guys coming on some woman or asked to
Mm-hmm.
mouth porn, which is not
Mm-hmm.
only humiliating but also germ festering, that there is a routine humiliation of women. And I think it
Mm-hmm.
compensates men for their lowered place in the economy. That those men who used to
Mm-hmm.
gain ascendancy over their wives and children because they had a family wage, those white
Mm-hmm.
men, don't have one anymore. And it's
That makes
burgeoned.
sense. Yeah.
Also, it's burgeoned as an industry. There's more money invested in porn than in all the sports teams combined.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you have more and more people. There was a study of co-eds at University of Kansas, and I think it was 12% said that they could not ever orgasm without porn on, and
Mm-hmm.
a percentage said they couldn't orgasm with a person, only with
Mm-hmm.
porn, because the same centers of the brain are activated by porn as are
Mm-hmm.
activated in a relationship, but you excise
Mm-hmm.
relationality, which makes people even more lonely.
Well, and
Ventukesh,
that's
I just want to say one more
yeah,
thing,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is
Uh-huh.
there's a professor, Ventukesh, at Columbia University in New York City, who did a study of high end prostitution and found that 40% of high end prostitution doesn't involve sex at all. It involves
Mm.
men being held and being able to talk intimately to a woman.
Yeah, that's really profound. A statistic, I don't have it offhand, but there was something from I think it was the 90s, but so this is another kind of piece to the puzzle as well. In various South American countries, when they went from not having TV at all to having TV, it came along with it, the sort of United Statesian um, domination of the airwaves. And so what
Mm,
came along with that was sort of generic advertising for like whatever, like Pepsi and I don't know, just generic
terrible
regular
stuff.
stuff that
Yeah.
we would be, yeah, that we're so used to now. We're like, oh, look, it's another, Pepsi ad or whatever. But because of the way that advertising had evolved in the U.S. Psyche, and that sex sells is the norm that no one really questions. The same thing kind of happened, and they found that almost overnight, teenage girls and I think women in their like just younger women who were seeing themselves in the advertisements and thinking, "Oh God, my body should look like that, not like this," and so eating disorders
Mm.
skyrocketed like overnight, pretty much. Maybe I'll look up the studies later and post them in our description, so it doesn't seem like I'm making things up. But so that's the other kind of conundrum is like the so with Cardi B, it's like the chicken or egg thing. Is it like what are the impacts? I mean, even I guess to say maybe there's some degree of empowerment for maybe more like young women are watching that stuff and just being like, I'm not going to be ashamed of liking these particular sex acts or like wearing these scanty clothes when I go out, or I don't know, maybe there's something where it's like, yeah, you don't have to feel ashamed of yourself anymore. Just be a sexual being or something, right? To sort of give that argument whatever credence it deserves. But to what degree also are like young women just like, wow, like my boobs are way too small, my butt's way too small, my hip to waist ratio is way too off, my hair is not straight enough, my lips are not supple enough or whatever, and then how much does that also feed like the plastic surgery industry as well. So it's like, where is where's the line between like supply and demand? And I do think that these modes of mass media are like massively influencing our psyches, our self-esteem, and even I did see some studies a while back on self-objectification, and they tried
Mm.
to define exactly what that meant. And if you think so, during slavery days, like chattel slaves who were ripped from the shores of Africa and sort of forced to be chattel slaves, they were objectified by the ruling class in the sense that they literally weren't people. They were just objects. They were property to make money from. Women were property forever until about 100 years ago, objects. But the evolution now is like objectification of women is is, it's not as extreme as like this woman's my property, but it's that she is a sort of collection of body parts,
Mm-hmm.
versus like she has some sort of autonomous personhood. So they were doing some psych studies. I think there's the APA website has stuff on this where women are, I don't know how they measure it, but the rates of self objectification are going up. And
Yes.
I think I don't, again, like I should know the exact way they do this, but it's essentially, um, especially young women seeing themselves less as people and
Mm-hmm.
more as a collection of body parts, and
That's
that's
right.
really what their worth is. Although I've also seen a little bit of studies that the same is happening to young men now as well.
Yes, they're much more
Um,
objectified and targeted by ads. But really,
right.
in this film, which not this film, this video, there's whores in the house. There's
Mm-hmm.
people selling their sex, and they
Mm-hmm.
are sort of a parade of mobile genitalia with big lips to add
Mm-hmm.
to the mix. That the
Mm-hmm.
idea that there are people and there are relationships rather than sexual access for money is completely absent. And to me,
Mm-hmm.
that is a symptom of a dying culture when people are no longer human but are sex objects or other objects to consume or to profit from, like the meat packers who can get COVID because you're making money off meat.
Mm-hmm.
That there
But
is
yeah.
not, when you dehumanize the mass of your people, you're doing something criminal to their psyches and
But
yours.
I guess the reason, maybe it's a generational thing. I'm not as shocked, or like I don't. My thing is, I feel like it's just a sort of shift within the capital. It's sort of late stage capitalism just kind of doing its thing. Is sort of the way I see it. Like that,
Yes.
this is just another manifestation of it, and it's not to minimize the psychological effects that it has, on all of us. That the fact that it's like, okay, this is, people of my generation simply we're not shocked by it at all
No.
anymore. We sort of laughingly be like, "Oh my god, did you see the Cardi B video? It's crazy. That shit is crazy." And we'll just ha 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 ha. Ha, oh my god, that's crazy, right? And then people will kind of debate things and critique it or whatever. But kind of going back to the janitor thing, like I don't think, when Martin Luther King was killed right before trying to promote the sanitation workers
Yeah.
unionizing. It's, I don't think, obviously the sort of the form is different in that, um, like Cardi B, like just being this super hypersexualized person, is very different than like sanitation workers fighting for the right for decent wages. Like I don't really think the structure of the economy is different in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, because what they're doing is Cardi B is saying, I'm selling my sex. I'm selling my sex and I'm selling this
Right.
video. And I'm owning that I am a precious commodity and I can make money off it. And
Mm-hmm.
you can fuck me and uh, I will swipe your credit card. It's so the man is just a
Mm-hmm.
source of credit and sexual satisfaction, and the woman of sexual satisfaction and sexual access, which is devoid of any other human or relational content. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why there's only 1% of sex ed that discusses consent or relationship. Whereas in
Right.
more civilized countries, relationship is part of the curriculum and it's part of sexuality rather than the disembodied sex in our wildly profitable porn industry.
Maybe a half opinion, half question for you, Harriet, because the chicken or the egg problem, right? So let's say we got really high quality, comprehensive sex ed in all the public schools, just all the schools in America tomorrow.
Hmm.
Um, do you think that WAP would still be as popular as a video?
No, I don't, because I think if kids grew up seeing sex as a normal expression of relationality and intimacy, then watching this gyrating set of genitals would be much less compelling. This is the release for highly repressed people. And in these other nations that are more civilized, they don't have a puritanical evangelical group deciding who can be sex educated, and how. This
Mm.
is a very backward country on all of those things. We have the highest
Mm.
teen pregnancy rate of all the developed countries because people don't even know. They're not educated. They don't have sex education. And the
Mm.
highest teen pregnancy rate is in Christian schools where they're not allowed even to discuss or know it.
Well, just how in the most anti-gay states, you actually have the highest rates of porn consumption. There's
Sure.
Pornhub
Utah.
puts out these statistics. Yeah. Well, also, I mean, the deep south,
That's right.
has the highest rates of gay porn.
Well,
But I think too. So okay, so you think if we had comprehensive sex ed stuff like so sort of this would be the consumer base would change, right? So the
that's right.
consumers of the hypersexualized sort of softcore rap sex industry would kind of change. I wonder to what degree, like if we had more universal social programs, even with that. So this would be like a nice, I don't know, thought experiment. Like let's say we had no sex ed, but everybody had healthcare. Um, well, I was going to say education, but I guess it should include comprehensive sex ed
Yes,
too.
it should.
Uh, Housing and all of that, because if what we're saying too is if the precarity of the economy is also causing this
Yes.
kind
That,
of bizarre like a sort of distorted pro sex work discussion, that's like
yes,
removed from the economy, like I wonder if that would also do it too, right? If
it would
people actually had
help.
their needs met.
These things would help. They're all contributors and they would
Yeah.
all help because sex work is driven by the precarity of the economy, the
Yeah.
inferior position of women as earners, the pressure on women since marriage has collapsed in
Mm.
having careers that can pay them. And if they want children that can support their children, 42% of kids are born outside of a marriage and outside of a male
Mm.
provider, so that the economic pressures are enormous. And so it's driven by those as well
Mm.
as in the absence of security, a whole porn industry that's out of control. And what's and people fleeing from relationality because it makes them vulnerable, and women particularly who are refusing marriage, and 70% of divorces are headed by women. It's now women who refuse marriage because they don't want to be vulnerable in an economy where they'll be killed.
Mm.
And these things, the economics and sexuality, are irrevocably entwined. And I think that's a point that's very important to understand. And our domination by evangelical puritanical culture is a terrible sin against our children in terms of their sexuality and their development.
I was reading some of the counter arguments to comprehensive sex ed last week, and I found this website run by what are they? There's those think tanks that something something family first kind of
Yeah,
names. They're
focus
like,
on family and family
yeah, like
first.
those kinds of things. And it was interesting to me. Like their arguments against comprehensive sex ed was that it was like terrifying because they were saying, introducing young kids to concepts like masturbation and stuff like leads them to I don't know, like touch each other and start early like to hypersexualize themselves at an early age and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, I'm trying to validate this. Like, so you guys have fears of if you teach kids about their genitals and body parts and STIs and stuff at like a young age, like, okay, now they're like thinking about sex more. Like, okay, I get your concern. But my understanding from the actual research is that sex ed, I mean, this kind of just goes along with, I think, a lot of probably our training as therapists is that like the more you avoid a thing, the kind of the bigger it gets, right? If you just
Absolutely.
stay in absolute denial about a thing, like your drinking problem, and just, oh, I'll just not think about it, I'll just keep drinking over and over and over again, and then
Right.
like you have full blown alcoholism. Like if you just pretend like you know 10 to 13-year-olds aren't suddenly thinking about sex. I mean, meanwhile, while there, this is probably a better argument for it. If you have Cardi B and porn, like teaching your 10-year-old kids that, basically they're a collection of body parts
Right.
that need to like do their best to find other collections of body parts and then to like jump into the attention economy to like put pictures and videos of their body parts online,
And make
and that
money.
that's what sexuality is. Yeah.
Mhm.
And that maybe this is their escape from poverty. If that's like really the only kind of sex ed your kids have, then, like expect things to not go well. But yeah, I agree with you too, in that, you were talking about consent in comprehensive sex ed earlier. And I was the community mental health clinic I worked at for like 5 years. I was somehow put in the position of being, it's called the juvenile sex offender team leader, which actually sounds kind of creepy, but it was like this sort of clinical team leader of the team that like treated the teen guys who were referred to us by probation. It was interesting because in almost every case, the concept of consent wasn't, some did say that they talked about it in school a little bit, but it was sort of an afterthought in sex ed for most of them. Like it mostly was like anatomy,
Yes.
and it wasn't talking about relationality. But at least half, if not most of them, also came from like pretty, like you're saying, puritanical, like pretty religious families as well. And I wondered if there is a correlation between that. Not to say like, I don't know, hardcore religion, I don't know, turns you into like a rapist or something, but like that the more you're sort of just taught almost punitively to like repress your
Yes.
sexuality, the more curious you become, and the more sort of unpracticed you become in actually developing the skills to like practice some sexuality with somebody, right? Like
Right.
you probably should talk about it early, not like too early, right? But like start figuring out like what are these body parts for,
For
and what are these
exactly.
what are these curiosities and these desires that I'm
That
starting to feel, and what do I do about them, and what do I not do
exactly.
about them, right?
Also,
That would be really helpful.
it's based on a totally unscientific idea.
Yeah.
Fetuses get erections in utero.
Right.
Kids masturbate because they discover their own genitals and that it feels nice.
Right.
As someone who has a doctorate in child development,
Mm.
I could see that every child discovers his or her own genitals unless they're horribly punished for it, and then they
Right.
discover them with shame. That's a natural process. You cannot run a daycare center without having kids playing I'll show me yours and I'll show me mine and you
Right.
show me yours. That just happens. When I was
Right.
a first grade teacher, a little girl came up to me and said, he said, if he touched my booty, he give me a quarter. He touched my booty, he didn't give me no quarter. So I called the boy over and I said, give her that quarter. That was an inappropriate request, which she complied with, and she's owed a quarter. And I said to her, watch out for letting people touch your body for money. It will get you cheated and in terrible trouble for the rest of your life.
Well, the evangelicals are clearly correct, Harriet, in that you just cranked out a sex worker out of the education system right then. Sorry, I'm making a joke. Okay, thank you for laughing. It was kind of a
Yeah.
shitty joke. But
Well,
yeah.
it makes sense, but children discover that they have body parts. They're interested in them because they're usually covered up. That's just the way it is. Kids are curious. I
Well, and they're covered
often,
up in our, in like, the closer you are to the equator and the more like indigenous you are, the less likely you are to actually cover up your gender.
exactly.
Like we actually forget, like there's like a whole lot of human beings that are still like running around naked because it's really hot and like they don't
Yeah,
care and it's fine.
that's right. And there's, I used to think, kind of as a little joke to myself, that instead of beginning the day in school, because kids don't go into school until they're 5 or even 3, they should start with 3 minutes of silent masturbation. It would be a lot better for them than the silent prayer.
Oh
And
God.
not that that was advocated by me or anyone else, but in terms of basic
Okay.
mental health, that would be a whole lot better for their mental health.
I am not associated with this woman trying to force everybody to masturbate.
No, I'm not, but it would make
Harriet
more
Fraud has been
sense.
canceled.
Right. It would make more sense developmentally
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
than 3 minutes of silent prayer, because people are sexual. They have sexual organs, they like to explore them, and they need to be taught responsibility and appreciation for their
Hmm.
bodies and also for
Hmm.
each other, which they're not taught. And that is so
Oh,
sad.
one of the other things about, I mean, now it's sort of porn, and porn is sort of escalated, like you said, of becoming more and
Mm,
more extreme. But if you even think of like the days of like pinup girls, like World War II,
mm,
that you have these pictures of what, like Betty Boop and women like that. They'd just be like, kind of like relatively average. I mean, like pretty women with like relatively average bodies, and they just have like a picture of them like making a kind of a seductive face, and maybe in like bras and underwear, be like posted next to their bunk or whatever. I have this
mhm.
stereotype in my head. I don't know if that's actually how it worked, but I'm pretty sure
Yeah, or
there'd be this whole
topless or
thing like,
something. Hmm.
or whatever, yeah. And it was like, like, oh man, this is, and that was probably like all these guys' masturbation material. It's just like, oh my god, just like a little like
Right.
tiny bit of a visual cue, and like you're just kind of fantasizing about this woman or whatever. And so the thing I wanted to say earlier was, I feel like there is something. This gets in a very dicey territory of talking about what is and isn't natural, but for whatever degree that visual stimulation is, and for like straight men, in particular, where it's like, oh, those body parts turn me on, like that
Hmm.
person with those body parts turn me on. I do think, and if somebody disagrees and you want to like email us and say you're totally wrong on this, there's a certain degree of biologicalness to that phenomenon, of like people liking the way that body part looks, which is different than objectification, and that it's not like you wouldn't just want like breasts or like a butt like just on their own. Like you actually want them connected to a whole body,
Right.
who is a human, like who is a person, right? And that there's this, there's the relationality attached. But I think, well, I'll use the McDonald's metaphor. The chemists behind the McDonald's phenomenon and everything around fast food, what they found was they kept refining the smallest units of what is attractive to the human taste buds as they could. They manipulated the political process to manipulate the food regulations and to
Mm,
get subsidies and everything, so that they could make it the absolute tastiest food that is terrible for you and is
mm.
extremely cheap, so that they could just sort of take over the world with it. I think the evolution of porn, and now the pornification of like regular kind of sex and dating and stuff, is a direct result of that kind of thing, of what the profit motive did to probably pretty biologically like normal um, desires, right? Like, oh, I like how I like how this part of this body looks, or how
Hmm.
this facial feature on a person looks, or whatever. And it just sort of evolved over time. But I think when I say evolve, I don't mean naturally. Like, I mean capitalists figure out how to continue milking this dominant industry that was now, reshaping culture and sexuality itself. So,
Well, I also think, though, that those tastes are developed. If the
right.
earliest sex statues that they found was the Venus of Willendorf, who has huge fat rolls, enormous
Mm,
pendulous breasts,
mm,
and huge cellulose thighs, but she
mm,
was fertile. And what they worshipped in primitive times, women goddesses, because they made people, good
mm,
trick. And they didn't
mm,
really understand the process. But I
mm,
think that those tastes are also developed. They're developed through advertising,
right.
they're developed through porn, they're developed through the media. And, one of the shocking things about the the producer Lena, whatever her name was, she had unattractive looking stars talking
Mm,
about their sexuality, and they didn't have
mm,
gorgeous bodies, and that was amazing.
mm,
And so that there's this interaction of natural desires, cultivated desires, manipulated desires to make a profit. And I think what this all comes down to is there is a perversion of us as people where we lose relationality, where we lose acceptance of who we are in ourselves, in our bodies, in our sexualities, and in our relationships to each other, so that other people can make money. And that is a symptom of our dying capitalism.
and all of that couched within the political economy of the time too, right? Where
Absolutely.
like I think, you know, and again in like say I don't know any random like hunter gatherer society or something, the political economy of like, you know, we I mean we don't even own the means of production, but we like go hunting and gathering in areas where we like, you know, we
Hmm.
like we get we ourselves do the stuff that we need. I would imagine that the all the different cultural habits that relate to like sexuality, relationality,
Right.
marriage rights, all of that are pretty intimately tied to like the political economy of that kind of culture, just like they are with ours.
Totally.
Um,
Totally.
but the difficulty I think for us is that we don't, and this is this concept that Adam Curtis made a documentary called Hypernormalization. It's like one of my favorite documentaries where it's so like hyper normal. It's so beyond normal. Like we all know that everything we're consuming in mass media is like totally fake and manufactured, but we're all sort of it's almost like a mass depression, like where we all kind of feel like hopeless and resigned to it, where we're like, well, I can't change, you know, like the next Cardi B video is going to be even crazier and I'm probably going to watch it and I'll like laugh and I'll cringe and I'll probably share it with somebody, and it's really disgusting, but oh, I guess that's just how it is, right? That we're like trapped in this weird um cycle now that like capitalism has evolved to this like monster that's so beyond our comprehension that it's hard to even imagine a different world.
It is, but one of the most exciting things about this period in which Trump has ruined our health, has ruined our cities, has ruined the infrastructure of our government, is that people are beginning to say no. This is not what we want. That not it is what it is. It is what it is, and I'm going to change it because this is not what I want, and I cannot
Mm,
accept this. This is not acceptable. I'm not going to just accept it as if I can't change it. I will change the things that are unacceptable. And that's a
yeah,
very exciting thing across the board. And that might
yeah,
be a good way to end up. I don't know, to finish this episode. What do you think, Max?
I think so. I think we're good.
Good.
I got some, I'm 3 hours behind you and there's some chores I got to do and stuff, so
Yeah, life goes
I'll
on.
jump off and do that. I know. No, this was great though, thank you. And also anybody listening, if anybody listening knows a lot about, say, sex work decriminalization or comprehensive sex ed or these general topics we're talking about, it'd be great to have somebody on that is a sort of not necessarily even an expert, but like pretty well versed in that stuff. Obviously, Harriet, you're like miles beyond, like millennia beyond
Well, I'm
my
old.
knowledge.
I've been
But
doing this for a long time, and I've also spoken about porn and its effect and studied porn and its effect and written about sex work and so on. But I wouldn't have even known about this song if it weren't for you.
I guess what would be really interesting to me are people who are kind of on the pioneering edge of decriminalization of sex work type of things, right? Or if they're organizing around pushing aggressively for comprehensive sex ed, like those kinds of things, to maybe amplify those voices, I guess is
That would be
um,
great. And
more what I mean.
there
Yeah,
are
that'd be
some
exciting.
very interesting modern sex workers, I mean modern sex educators who are pushing things that weren't pushed. One of them in a an email that I sent you has a group that goes topless, and they're all people who've had double mastectomies, and they
Yeah,
go topless and sing topless, which is something that would have been unheard of because they're saying we do accept our bodies, even though they're not at all the body of porn.
right, right.
Anyhow, I think this was great. Thanks for
Hmm.
introducing me to Cardi B.
Of course.
I'd heard the name,
um,
but I'd never seen these things. My daughter knew all about it, of course.
yeah. Okay. Well, if anybody wants to contact us, you can email us at it's not just in your head at gmail.com. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. And that's it. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.